If US President Donald Trump bombs Iran, nuclear weapons are on the table. That's the stark message Iran is delivering to Trump following his threats to bomb Iran if it doesn't agree to direct negotiations over the country's nuclear program. The single statement has the potential to completely shake up the power balance of the Middle East. However, it also places Iran on a direct collision course with the US in a nuclear battle that it has no hope of winning. Let's start with Khamenei's threat. On March 31, media reported on a speech given by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei to mark the end of Ramadan, which is the Islamic fasting month. The US and Israel threatened to attack us, which we don't think is very probable, but if they commit any mischief, they will surely receive a strong reciprocal blow, Iran's Supreme Leader claimed in his Eid al-Fitr remarks. If it's carried out, they will definitely receive a strong counterattack. On April 1st, France 24 then reported on remarks that Ali Larijani, an advisor to Iran's Supreme Leader, made on Iranian state TV. "We're not moving towards nuclear weapons," the advisor claimed. "But if you do something wrong in the Iranian nuclear issue, you will force Iran to move towards that because it has to defend itself. Iran does not want this, but it will have no choice." Khamenei's advisor continued, "If at some point you, meaning the US, move towards bombing by yourself or through Israel, you will force Iran to make a different decision." These statements made by both Khamenei and his trusted advisor begs the question, why is Iran making nuclear threats now? For one, Trump is claiming that the US is preparing to bomb Iran. In March, Trump sent a letter to Iran demanding that the country come to the table to negotiate a new nuclear deal with the US. Some might have seen this letter as a strange demand. After all, it was Trump who pulled the US out of a previous deal with Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, during his first term as US president. That deal, negotiated by the administration of President Barack Obama, saw Iran agree to limit its uranium enrichment activities to such a low level that it wouldn't be capable of producing a nuke, as well as agreed to limit its purchases of centrifuges needing for that enrichment process. In return, Iran received relief from sanctions that were costing the country's economy billions of dollars. The US was one of the original signatories of the JCPOA, along with China, Russia, France, and the UK. However, Trump withdrew the US from the deal in 2018, preferring instead to re-implement sanctions that have had a devastating effect on Iran's economy. By February 2021, those US sanctions had cost Iran about $1 trillion, so that seems like a win for the US. However, the withdrawal from the JCPOA also meant that the most important nuclear nation in the deal couldn't impact it anymore. China and Russia both have ties with Iran, with the latter growing closer to Iran since. Putin launched his supposed special military operation in Ukraine, meaning they wouldn't act as much of a deterrent. France and the UK combined to have around 500 nukes of their own, but they simply didn't bring as much influence to the table as the United States. The result of Trump's JCPOA withdrawal was that Iran started breaking the terms of the deal. Its justification was that the US had already broken the deal. Its new sanctions were the opposite of the relief it expected, so it should be free to renew its nuclear program. Trump's March letter seeking direct negotiations with Iran was met with a swift refusal by the country. Iran claimed that it couldn't trust the US to keep its word in any direct negotiations, though it also proposed the possibility of indirect negotiations via intermediaries in Oman. That won't work for the US. As the Iran Center points out, Iran and Oman have strong military ties that see them frequently engage in joint military exercises, meaning it wouldn't be a neutral mediator. The US believes Iran could manipulate Oman into helping it secure the best possible deal for itself, which runs counter to what Trump wants to achieve. Trump's response was to deliver the most direct military threat the US has made toward Iran in years. On March 30, he said that if Iran doesn't make a deal, they'll be bombing. It will be bombing the likes of which they've never seen before. That threat led to an immediate condemnation from Iranian Foreign Minister Ismail Baghaei. The explicit threat of bombing Iran by the head of a country is a clear contradiction to the essence of international peace and security, said the minister. Such a threat is a gross violation of the United Nations Charter and a violation of the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards regime. Violence brings violence and peace creates peace. America can choose. Remarks by the Supreme Leader and his advisor followed just a couple of days later. Trump's direct threats of a bombing campaign may be the primary reason for Iran's threats of putting nukes on the table. However, it's not the only one. As Baghahi implied in his remarks, Iran believes that the US threat is a case of a country throwing stones in a glass house. This view is reinforced by comments made by senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps General Amirali Waizadeh. The Americans have at least 10 bases in the region around Iran, and they have 50,000 troops, the general claimed. Someone who's in a glass room shouldn't throw stones at anyone. Waizadeh has a point. In fact, his numbers, at least when it comes to bases, may even be generous. According to Al Jazeera, the US maintains 10 military bases in Saudi Arabia, though they're staffed by just 381 troops. The 10 bases it has in Kuwait brings the total up to 20, with another 13 US bases being in Turkey. We also can't ignore the current presence of US warships, including the aircraft carrier, the Harry S. Truman, in the Red Sea, or America's recent decision to move around half of its nuclear-capable B-2 Spirit bomber fleet to the remote base of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. All of these bases offer routes into Iran for the United States and are used by the US to maintain its influence over the Middle East. The general's point is that the US is making threats against Iran because Iran is trying to do the same thing the US does. That's just as relevant to power projection in the Middle East as it is to the notion of Iran having nuclear weapons in the first place. It's one rule for the US and another for the rest of the world, according to Iran, which is what allows Trump to make his bombing threats. Iran's message is that it's had enough of that power balance, and it's willing to respond by pushing the nuclear button. But while Iran can make all of the threats about a nuclear response that it wants, is the country even capable of launching a nuke if it feels that the time calls for it? The short answer is no, at least not yet. Iran doesn't have access to any nuclear weapons. That's according to the Council on Foreign Relations, which confirms that Iran has no nukes, while adding that it has a long history of engaging in secret nuclear weapons research in violation of its international commitments. One of those commitments is the JCPOA, which Iran started ignoring after Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018. And the breakdown of that deal may have brought it closer to having a nuclear weapon than many in the international community might want to admit. How close? Iran may be just months away if it steps up its nuclear program. Iran Watch points out that Trump's decision to remove the US from the JCPOA sparked several violations of the agreement from Iran's end. These violations began in July 2019, around a year after Trump's withdrawal decision, and saw Iran start to enrich uranium above the 3.67% uranium U-235 limit set by the JCPOA. That's important because U-235 is the isotope that makes a nuclear detonation possible. Most modern nukes have U-235 enriched to 90% U-235, though it's possible to build a nuke with just 25% enrichment. As of April 2021, Iran was at the point where it was enriching uranium to 60% U-235, which Iran Watch says means it's done 90% of the work needed to get its uranium to the appropriate levels. Iran has also been acquiring and installing IR-2 and IR-6 centrifuges in its nuclear production facilities since the US broke away from the JCPOA. These centrifuges are key to the uranium enrichment process, and it's from these components that Iran Watch determines its months-away numbers. The resource says that Iran could build a nuclear weapon in just 4 months if it has 3,000 IR-2M centrifuges operating at full capacity. If it has 3,000 IR-6 centrifuges, that time is slashed to less than 3 months, with Iran being capable of building 5 nuclear weapons inside a year. Does Iran have those centrifuges? We have no real idea because of the secrecy surrounding its nuclear program and its refusal to cooperate with the original signatories of the JCPOA now the US has pulled away. The Institute for Science and International Security paints an even grimmer picture of Iran's nuclear capabilities. The unfortunate reality is that Iran already knows how to build nuclear weapons, although there are some unfinished tasks related to the actual construction of them, the group says. It says several of the tentpoles Iran needs to make nuking an enemy possible are already in place. It knows how to enrich uranium to the appropriate level. Iran also has delivery systems, including nuclear-capable missiles ready to go. It only needs to figure out how to properly weaponize its weapons-grade uranium, which involves further development and testing. Assuming Iran accelerates its nuclear program in response to US threats, it's possible that this weaponization could be achieved before the end of 2025. And back in January 2025, the Telegraph reported that Iran was working alongside North Korea to develop nuclear missiles capable of traveling up to 1,864 miles. Tehran has never been as weak and vulnerable as it is today, said National Council of Resistance of Iran, or NCRI, representative Shona Shamsami at the time. The desperate Iranian regime is speeding up the development of nuclear weapons. Now is the time to hold the regime accountable for internal killings, regional warmongering, and nuclear weapons development. It's a little over 2 months since Shamsami made those comments, and holding Iran accountable is precisely what Trump is trying to do. That's why he's attacking the Houthis in Yemen. Trump's goal here is to cut the head off a group that Iran uses as proxies for achieving its regional goals. It's also why he's using bombing threats to force Iran to come to the table. However, these threats seem to be pushing Iran into the acceleration of a nuclear program that is already fairly close to completion. Still, close doesn't mean ready. Iran can't launch one of its own nuclear weapons at the United States right now, at least if reporting about the full extent of its nuclear program is accurate. But if that's the case, how can the country be making nuclear threats? The US could bomb it into oblivion, targeting Iran's nuclear facilities in the process, before Iran is ready to press the nuclear button. But Iran may have a nuclear trick up its sleeve: Russia. On April 1st, Russia warned of catastrophic consequences for the US if it follows through on bombing Iran. Threats are indeed being heard. Ultimatums are also being heard, claimed Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. We consider such methods inappropriate. We condemn them. We consider them a way for the US to impose its will on the Iranian side. The message was followed by a claim that Russia would be happy to serve as a mediator between Iran and the US, though neither side has responded. A couple of days later, Russia cemented its support of Iran in the nuclear conflict by again threatening vague consequences. The country's foreign ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, said, "The use of military force by Iran's adversaries in the context of political resolution is illegal and unacceptable. External threats to bomb Iran's nuclear energy infrastructure would inevitably lead to far-reaching and irreversible consequences." Did Russia just suggest it might provide Iran with nuclear weapons if the US bombs? Not in so many words, but we can't ignore the fact that Russia's comments come at the same time as nuclear threats coming out of Iran. Of course, we also can't ignore the hypocrisy at play here. Russia is condemning a US plan to supposedly bomb Iranian energy infrastructure at a time when its president, Vladimir Putin, is raining bombs down on Ukraine. The country also signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran in January 2025, further allying itself with America's most recent enemy. Russia is also no stranger to making nuclear threats of its own. Since Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022, he's made almost constant threats or implications regarding Russia's potential use of nuclear weapons. United 24 Media published a timeline of these threats. Immediately after the invasion, Putin announced that he was placing Russia on nuclear alert. He's constantly warned of countries facing consequences beyond any they could imagine if they help Ukraine, which mirrors Russia's threats now regarding Iran. April 2022 saw Russia warn that it would deploy nuclear-capable hypersonic missiles if Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Both did, and it seems like Russia did nothing. A year later, Russia was claiming that the risk of nuclear conflict was at its highest level since the Cold War. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Medvedev, threatened Ukraine, the UK, Germany, and the US with nuclear weapons in February 2024. The list goes on. Now, does this mean that Russia may be about to arm Iran with nuclear weapons? Well, it certainly could. The Arms Control Association notes that Russia has 5,580 nuclear weapons, only 1,549 of which are already strategically deployed. That leaves a stockpile of over 4,000 tactical nuclear weapons, some of which could feasibly find their way into Iran to back the country's threat of bringing nuclear weapons to the table. Even if Russia doesn't contribute nukes directly, we have no idea just how much advice it's giving Iran in its quest to build its own warheads. The countries have a long history of nuclear cooperation. That cooperation started in the 1990s as Iran recovered from its war with Iraq. Russia assisted Iran, alongside China and Pakistan, to help the country move its nuclear program forward. That work supposedly concluded in 1995 and focused on helping Iran build nuclear reactors. But Russia likely continued to help Iran through much of the 1990s, according to Iran Watch. And even though Russia was a signatory of the JCPOA we mentioned earlier, that doesn't change the fact that Iran has a track record of turning to Russia when it needs nuclear help. Could it be doing the same again now that it's under threat from the US? The comments from Khamenei and his advisor suggest it might be, with Russia's condemnation of the US adding fuel to that fire. Even if Russia doesn't provide nuclear weapons to Iran directly, it can justify supporting the country's nuclear program under the two-country Strategic Defense Cooperation Agreement. So, what happens if Iran actually ends up getting its hands on a nuclear weapon? For one, the threat of bringing nukes to the table will become very real very fast. Even so, Iran wouldn't be able to compete with the US on the nuclear level. The 1 or 2 warheads it might have would pale in comparison to the 5,225 much more powerful nuclear weapons the US brings to the table. That means we're not going to see Iran launch its nukes against the US, even if it wants to. The threat of reprisal is too great, and Iran doesn't have the missiles needed to hit the US anyway. But perhaps the threat of bringing nuclear weapons to the table is less about the US and more about Iran restoring its power projection in the Middle East. After all, the past few months have seen it essentially lose Hamas and Hezbollah to the Israeli war effort. It's in the process of losing the Houthis thanks to US airstrikes, and it's witnessed the fall of the former Syrian regime that it once counted as an ally. To Iran, acquiring a nuclear weapon allows it to threaten the Middle East, which in turn presents an indirect threat to the US. Bomb us and we'll use a nuclear weapon on one of your allies, the Iranian threat seems to imply. If nothing else, Iran obtaining a nuke would give it a much more powerful deterrent against Israel, as that country ramps up its Gaza campaign in the wake of a failed ceasefire. It would also put a dent in the US's attempts to control the Middle East narrative. Iran wouldn't even need to launch nukes, simply having them could be enough to force the US into slowing down on its bombing rhetoric, which gives the vulnerable Iranian regime time to breathe and consider its next move. It's also possible that this entire situation will be averted. Though Trump is outwardly pushing Iran toward direct nuclear negotiations, which is why he made his bombing threats in the first place, he also appears to be privately considering Iran's offer of indirect talks. It's unlikely that Oman will be the destination for those discussions, but according to Axios on April 2nd, the White House is still engaged in a heavy debate about whether a nuclear deal is possible and how that deal could be achieved. All the rest of the world can do is wait and see what happens. One thing is for certain, Iran has just kicked up its nuclear rhetoric at a time when it faces the greatest threat to its Middle East influence in several decades. Whether that rhetoric is serious or not, the US has been placed on notice. Trump now has the nuclear problem to consider before he follows through on his threats of bombing Iran. But what do you think about this situation? Are Iran's nuclear threats credible? Is it possible that Russia will help Iran behind the scenes? How will the US respond now that nuclear weapons are on the table? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date commentary on the situation in the Middle East. We're an independent source of news and information about military conflicts around the globe, and greatly appreciate your support.